Let's get into Matthew chapter 13. We're going to read now Jesus' explanation of the parable of the sower. So look at verse 18. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one on whom seed was sown beside the road. The one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places. This is the man who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. And the one on whom seed was sown on the good soil, this is the man who hears the word and understands it, and indeed bears fruit, and brings forth some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. I know this is a familiar passage to us. I know that among all of the parables that Jesus told when he was living and preaching, this is one of the most popular ones. And so I want to ask you this morning not to tune out what I'm saying because of familiarity with this parable. I'd like to try to look at this parable perhaps in somewhat fresh eyes and look at this in maybe not a new way. It's going to be looking at some of the same old points that we've made from this, but I would like for us to consider one thing from this parable that maybe we've not considered before, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I used to look at this parable like this. When we preach the word, when we preach the gospel, people will respond in one of 4 different ways. And we could break this parable down into a parable of percentages. So as we preach, and there are 4 different responses, then 25% of the people that we preach to will respond this way, 25% this way, 25 and 25. It's kind of the way I used to look at this parable. But I don't believe that anymore. I don't look at this parable in that way anymore. And there's a couple of reasons why that is. Number one, my own life experience in preaching the word and sharing this message has not proven that to be the case. It hasn't proven that this is a parable of percentages. If this was that kind of parable, that 25% would respond this way and 25 all the way down the line, then here's what that would mean. That would mean that 75% of people who hear the gospel, at least initially, would obey it. Right? Because the second soil, the rocky soil, it says he immediately receives the word with joy. He immediately responds to the preaching. Then the thorny soil, they would respond. And then the good soil. So 75% of people who hear the gospel are going to at least initially obey it. Now, I know from my personal experience in preaching and studying the Bible with people that 3/4 of the people that I share the message with do not immediately respond to the gospel. So it's not a parable of percentages because of that. But here's the main reason I don't see this as a parable of percentages. And this is really, it's from this point that I want to proceed through the rest of the lesson. The second reason I don't see it that way is because as this story is about the hearts of men and women and their willingness to listen to the gospel and respond to it, this is a parable about their hearts. And here's what I know about hearts. Hearts can change. People's hearts can change over time. The heart that you have today is probably not the heart that you had 10 years ago. The heart that you have today is probably not the same heart that you're going to have 10 years from now. Things happen in our lives. People come into our lives. And those people and those events, they change us. We were talking about Jonah in Bible class this morning. And we were talking from chapter 1 when Jonah was running away from the Lord, and he's on that ship that's en route to Tarshish, and that storm comes over the sea, and the sailors are terrified, and they're crying out to their God. And then there's Jonah down in the stern of the ship, and he's snoring. Jonah's fast asleep. And I shared this with Ronnie after class. When I was a kid and I couldn't sleep at night, my grandmother would say, well, you got a guilty conscience. What'd you do? You probably heard that too. You got a guilty conscience. Jonah must not have had a guilty conscience. He didn't feel bad about his disobedience to God. He's down there sleeping. He's not worried about his disobedience at all. But what happened? Well, he was thrown overboard, and then this big fish comes and swallows him, and he stays inside that fish for 3 days and 3 nights. You think that woke him up? Yeah, you look in chapter 2 and he starts praying and he's just saying, God, I'm so sorry. Get me out of this. I know you'll rescue me. I know you'll take care of me. What happened? Events and circumstances changed his heart. That happens to us. I know from my own personal life that the heart that I possess today is not the same heart that I had 15 years ago. And you could probably say the same thing about your life. That the heart that you have now is probably not the same heart that you had years ago. And so here's what I'm learning from this. At some point throughout all of our lives, we may find ourselves at any one of these 4 types of soil, these 4 types of hearts. I don't think God predestines us when we're born and He says, okay, you know what, Ben's going to be rocky soil all of his life. And John is going to be thorny soil all of his life, and there's nothing you can do to change it. That's not the way to understand this. There was a time in my life when I was rocky soil. There was a time in my life when I was wayside soil too. I've been in every one of these, and perhaps you have too. So what I want to do with you is consider these soils and these hearts from that perspective. The question that we oftentimes ask when we study this soil is, which soil are you? Good question. Here's a better question. Which soil are you today at this point in your life? I think that's a better question. And so I want to consider this morning, the seed and the soils, and let's talk about these things. Let's talk about these soils. First, let's talk about this sower and the seed. These are the only 2 constants in the parable. The sower is the same sower throughout. The seed is the same seed throughout. Those 2 things don't change. What does change, though, is the soil upon which the seed falls. So the first soil that we have is the roadside or the wayside soil. And if you can't read those words on the graphics, don't worry about it. I just put the pictures there for your enjoyment. There's really not a whole lot up there that you're not going to get in the words from that you won't get from the parables themselves. But the seed is scattered on the road, and some accounts say that the birds come and eat up those seeds. They don't really have time to germinate because the birds come and they eat them. That seed may just sit there on that roadside, on that sidewalk. Maybe the birds don't come and eat these, but the seeds aren't going to germinate on that sidewalk. They're just sitting there. So Jesus says in Matthew chapter 13, and in verse 4, He says, some seed fell beside the road, and the birds came and they ate them up. But then in the explanation of this, when you look at chapter 13 and verse 19, He says, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and he does not understand it, he doesn't understand it. Why doesn't he understand it? Well, the birds came and ate it before he had time. No. He doesn't understand it. I want to suggest to you, there may be 3 reasons that I want to share with you. There may be more. It may be, number 1, because he's irreligious. He doesn't understand it because he doesn't care to understand it. He doesn't want to understand it. And I think this is typically the person that we think about when we think about the roadside soil. The guy who's, he's the militant atheist. He's the hater of God. He doesn't care about God or the Bible or any of that, and he's the roadside soil. Well, he can be. But that's not the only kind of person who can be roadside soil. He doesn't understand it because he's irreligious. He doesn't care about religion. He doesn't want to understand it. But let me give you a second person who I think falls in this category of roadside soil. Somebody who's simply ignorant. Maybe they're not capable of grasping it. Maybe they're immature. And so I would give you an example of a little child. And we send our children to Bible classes, and we scatter seed on their hearts. And it may be that the things that we teach those little children in those Bible classes, while there are some things that they can grasp, some concepts that are simple, there are other things that we teach our children that they are not yet capable of grasping. They're just too young. And it's not a fault with them. It's not a defect within them. It's just immaturity. It's their age. They just aren't able to grasp those deep concepts. Let me give you an example. What about the concept of obedience? Do you remember that song that we sing to our kids where we spell the word obedience? O-B-E-D-I-E-N-C-E. Do you sing that song? Yeah. We sing that song to our kids. Obedience is the very best way to show God that you believe. And our kids can grasp the simple concept of obedience. Well, I need to do what God says. I need to do what mommy and daddy say. And in the same way, I need to do what God says. And that's a very shallow, superficial understanding of obedience. But we don't expect 4, 5, 6-year-old kids to grasp the depths of obedience. Sometimes obedience is hard. Sometimes God asks us to do things that are not easy. And we don't expect 5-year-olds to grasp that. And that's why we don't have 5-year-old children coming forward during the invitation wanting to be baptized. Because they don't understand the depth of it. They don't understand the depth of that obedience. And so there are some people that we scatter seed upon, and simply because of their ignorance or their immaturity, they don't understand it. They don't grasp the things that Jesus is trying to say to them. Immaturity can affect all ages. So here you've got a man who doesn't become a Christian until he's 70 years old. He's been out in the world all of his life. Spiritually, although he's 70 years old, spiritually, he's extremely immature. And there may be things that he doesn't understand. Again, it's not a defect, it's not a fault, it's just immaturity. Well, let me give you a third reason somebody may hear the word of the kingdom and not understand it. And that's because they might be impatient. Maybe they're impatient. This may be the one that can even affect us at times. We don't give the seed enough time to grow. We don't give the seed enough time to influence us. And let me give you a way that can show itself. Impatience can manifest itself when we want easy, shallow preaching. Preacher, don't give me anything that's too deep. Don't give me anything that's too complex. Don't give me anything that's going to challenge me. Just give me something that's real simple, that fits together in a nice little package that I can stick in my shirt pocket and take with me to work on Monday. Give me something that's not going to step on my toes. Just give me something that's, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Let's just keep it simple, okay? Why do you feel that way? I want to suggest to you that you might be thinking that way because you're impatient. Because you don't want to give God the time necessary to let the word sink deeply into your heart. And so you want that kind of easy preaching that doesn't require much of you. You want that shallow preaching that doesn't make you go deeply into the Word. It doesn't make you do the mental gymnastics that are sometimes necessary to understand the Scriptures. There's an illustration that some of you may have some experience with in your own lives. I certainly don't. I'm a city slicker. I didn't grow up in the country. But sometimes we talk about chewing the cud. Right? You've heard that expression, chew the cud. And that comes from cows, and I'm sorry this is kind of unsettling, at least to a city slicker like me it is. But, that's called rumination. And so there are the cows out in the pasture, and they're eating the grass, and they chew it up, and they swallow that grass, and then they let it sit there. And I don't know how much time goes by, but then they they bring that wad of grass back up and they start chewing on it some more. After the stomach's been working on it a little bit, they chew on it some more, and then they swallow it again, and then they do it again. And you're thinking, this is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And it is, but here's the point. We need to chew the cud of Scripture. We need to be ruminating on Scripture. There are things in Scripture that are hard. If somebody stands before you and says that the Bible is the easiest book on earth, it's like reading Dr. Seuss, they're lying to you. There are things in Scripture that are simple. There are things that are easy. But there are some things in here that are hard. And when somebody obeys the gospel, we don't take them to Daniel chapter 10 and try to explain to them the visions and all the things that Daniel saw. They're not ready for that yet. We don't have new convert Bible studies in the book of Revelation because they need to chew the cud. They're not ready for that yet. And that goes back to the previous point. The ignorant, the immature, they're just not there yet. But for those of us who are beyond the point of immaturity, we've been Christians for years and years and years, it's time for us to be ruminating. It's time for us to be chewing the cud of Scripture, to looking into those deep books and challenging ourselves mentally and working in and reading those books and working into those things, trying to grapple with those texts. We need to be doing that. And if we're not doing that, it may be because we're impatient. And if that's where we are, then we're wayside soil. Because the seed of Revelation and the seed of Daniel and the seed of Ezekiel is just sitting there on that heart. But it can't grow because we're not putting forth the time. We're not putting forth the effort. I think religious people can be wayside soil. Let me give you a biblical example. What about the apostles? How many times did Jesus tell His apostles, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm going to be mistreated. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to die. And then on the third day, I will rise again. And what did the apostles say? No. That's not going to happen to you. We're not going to let that happen to you. No. You don't know what you're talking about. What's the problem? They're wayside soil. What Jesus was telling them was just sitting there. It wasn't sinking into their hearts. They weren't believing it. They weren't accepting it. It just sat there. But then what happened? Life experience happened. They watched Jesus as He was in the garden when those Roman soldiers led by Judas came in and arrested Him. They watched Jesus as He hung there on that cross and He was crucified. They saw Jesus after He rose from the dead. And then what happened? Their hearts changed. The seed fell in and they said, oh, we remember what He said. Wayside soil until life happened. And it opened their hearts to receive it. We'll look at Matthew 13. Look at verse 5. Let's talk about the second kind of soil. Matthew 13, verse 5. Others fell on the rocky places where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up because they had no depth of soil. But when the sun had risen, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And then in the explanation in verse 20, Jesus says, the one on whom seed was sown on the rocky places, this is the man who hears the word and he immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution arises because of the word, immediately he falls away. This one is not the impenetrable ground like the wayside soil, but this is the shallow ground. This is the one where there's that bedrock, and on top of it there may just be an inch of soil. Not a whole lot of depth, but that seed falls onto that shallow soil and it sprouts. This is the person, this is the heart that is impulsive. This is the heart that is easily excited and very passionate. This is the one that's like magnesium. Do you remember those experiments when you were in physical science in high school? You burn magnesium and it burns bright white for about 3 seconds and then it fizzles out. These are the magnesium hearts. I like to call them the New Year's resolution hearts. And you know what I mean by that. we get to Thanksgiving and then we get through Christmas and we've eaten 30 pounds of turkey and ham and stuffing and everything, and we say, man, I got to get in the gym. My pants don't fit anymore. And so January 1st, we go to the gym and we sign up, and we sign up for this, ridiculous contract. We're going to come here and we're going to spend $300 a month to come to the gym, and we're going to work out. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. And it lasts for about 2 weeks. And somebody says, hey, how you doing on your workout? Well, that's the rocky soil. This is the New Year's resolution soil. I think this is oftentimes a characteristic of young people. I've seen among young people, and you have too, and I've lived it. I did this myself when I was a teenager. You see among young people this kind of passion and excitement that's always short-lived. And so here's this teenage girl. She comes home from high school and she's going, she's grinning from ear to ear and she's so excited and she's blushing. And you say, well, what's going on with you? And she says, I've just met the greatest boy. And we started dating today, and he's so wonderful. He's the love of my life. We're going to get married. I already know where we're going to live, and yada, yada, yada. And you're listening to this as a parent, and you're thinking, 10 days, they're going to break up. And so 10 days later, she comes home from school and she's sobbing and she's got tears streaming down. She's makeup's running down. Oh, he broke up with me. I thought he was the one. And you say, yeah, get 10 days. She'll be okay. Peaks and valleys, right? Ups and downs. That's what I see in this soil. High school drama. That's what I see. That's what this is. And there are people who come to the Lord like this. They get all excited about this new thing, this new Bible thing, this new God thing, this new church thing. They get all excited about it, and you study with them and you talk to them about Jesus, and they obey the gospel and they're excited and they're just burning as brightly as they can. But then 6 months later, they're not coming to church anymore. Things have happened. They've gotten discouraged. They're not in it anymore. I think about what Jesus said in Luke 14 and verse 28 when he said, if you want to be my disciple, you need to count the cost. You need to think about what is involved in this. You need to know fully what you are coming into if you choose to be my disciple. And there are many people who don't make that calculation. There are many people who don't put forth that time to understand fully what is involved. And so they get all excited about it, and it fizzles out in just a short time. This man's joy is immediate only. It is just temporary. It is not lasting. But our joy as Christians, the joy that we have, is joy that we want to be long-term. We don't want it to be short-lived. We want it to be long-term. And what that means is our joy needs to be firmly rooted, but if it's going to be firmly rooted, it means it needs to also be tempered with understanding about what Jesus said about persecution and about trials and difficulties that come into our lives. I don't want you to miss this. Notice in chapter 13 and verse 21 where he says, this man has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary, and when affliction or persecution arises because of the word. So this man says, I want to follow you wherever you go, Lord. You remember Luke chapter 9? That's what one of those men, he came to Jesus and he said, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. And you remember Jesus said to him, okay, but let me tell you, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. What's he doing? Jesus is saying, I'm giving you some more numbers for your calculation. You're going to count the cost. Let me give you some things to add into the equation. I don't have a place to call home. I don't have a place to sleep. Are you sure you want to follow me wherever I go? Count the cost. Jesus, you didn't tell me about this persecution thing. You didn't tell me that if I followed you, people were going to hate me. You didn't tell me that my family was going to treat me differently now that I'm a Christian. You didn't tell me that my coworkers and my friends were going to ridicule me because I profess faith in you. You didn't tell me about that, Lord. Count the cost. Think long term. And let our joy be tempered by the expectations that persecution and trials will come. If we enter into it understanding that, expecting that, then we won't be this New Year's resolution soil. We won't be this rocky, shallow ground. All right, let's look at the third one. verse 7 as well as verse 22. This is the thorny ground. I like to say that this heart is distracted. It's not impenetrable, it's not shallow, but it's distracted. It's crowded. This heart has made room for other things than the word of the Lord. In the explanation in verse 22, Jesus said that this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Note that last expression. It becomes unfruitful. That means it was fruitful at one time, but it is no more. It is no more because of these other distractions, these other cares, these other worries that it is engaging. Turn with me to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. You know this story. Jesus is in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Martha, in verse 40, was distracted with all her preparations. I think sometimes we give Martha a hard time. But let me ask you something. What would you be doing if Jesus was coming to your house? Wouldn't you be killing the fattened calf and trying to get out your white tablecloth and bring your china out and do all of that? Well, that's what Martha's doing. Her intentions are good. But she gets a little bit out of shape because her sister Mary is not helping her with all those preparations. But did you notice in verse 40 it says that Martha was distracted? She was distracted. Do you think Jesus would have cared if Martha brought out the paper plates and cups instead of the fine china? I don't think so. I don't think Jesus would have cared. But Martha was distracted with those things, and she says, Lord, don't you care? My sister Mary, she's not helping me. She's not doing anything to help me with all these preparations. And you remember, Jesus said in verse 41, Martha, you are worried and bothered over so many things. She's distracted, she's worried, she's bothered. She's thorny ground at the moment. She's thorny ground. She's got so many things that are going on right now, and she can't see the true value of having Jesus there in her presence. Mary saw that, and to her credit, she listened to the word that Jesus was speaking. I think this stage in life is oftentimes the most easily seen in maybe young adulthood, my stage of life. Because this is a time in our lives where we become worried and distracted and concerned about so many things. You know, we graduate high school and we supposedly become adults when we turn 18, although for many of us that's debatable. I know it certainly was for me. So we go to college and we study and we get our degree, and then we graduate college and then we get a job and we start taking on responsibility in that job. And then we meet somebody and we fall in love and we get married and then we have children. And as responsibilities increase in our lives, so do our distractions and our worries and our concerns. This has just been magnified for me since kids have come along, and I suspect it was the same for you. You know, when you're out there on your own, yes, you need to be responsible because, you do need to take care of yourself. But when you get married, that responsibility steps up a little bit because now I've got somebody else that I need to care for. Now I have a lady who's come into my life, and if I don't care for her, her father's going to kill me. So, responsibility increases. Well, then children come in, and man, you feel that weight of responsibility. Kind of like Joe was talking about it around the table this morning. I appreciated those thoughts so much. The pressing down in that olive press, you feel that when you become a parent. I've got this little thing that I don't know what to do with, but I have to take care of it. And then as soon as you have children, you start thinking about things like health care, life insurance, disability insurance. And you start thinking about all of those things. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? How am I going to provide for my family if I were to die suddenly? And so you have to put a will together now. And you start thinking about all of these things, and it boggles your mind how much you can become concerned and worried about those things. And you're just trying to do right by your family. You're trying to provide for them and take care of them. But I want to tell you, you can keep yourself up at night worrying about all of these things. And that is the circumstance where I have found myself at times. And I suspect you have too. Are you still in Luke? Flip back to chapter 8. This is interesting. In Luke chapter 8, you have the parallel account of the parable of the sower. You have Luke's version of it. Look at verse 14 of Luke chapter 8. The seed which fell among the thorns, these are the ones who have heard, and as they go on their way, they are choked with worries and riches and pleasures of this life, and they bring no fruit to maturity. They are choked. I want you to notice that word choked. The thorns come into the soil, and they're not weeded out, they're not taken out, and it chokes the plant that is to be fruitful. Look at verse 42 of Luke chapter 8. This is interesting. This is when Jesus is approached by a man named Jairus. He has a sick daughter. He wants Jesus to come and heal his daughter. Now verse 42. For he had an only daughter about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. That word pressing is the same word as the word choked in verse 14. So these worries and these distractions and these concerns that we have in our lives, they press in on us. And our fears and our responsibilities. Let me tell you one that's really pressing on me right now. Do you know what it's going to cost for my children to go to college? I mean, I see these estimations and they're like, start saving your money now. By the time your baby is going to college, it's only going to cost $4.2 million a semester. I mean, these calculations of the cost of college are just ridiculous. And I'm thinking, how in the world am I going to... What's it doing? Pressing in. Those concerns, those worries, those fears, they press in and they bother us. Luke's gospel also talks about the pleasures of life in verse 14. It's not just the concerns that we have about providing for our families and the responsibilities, but sometimes it's the pleasures of life that get into the way. It's the worldliness. It's the lusts of this world. It's the things that the world is placing before us that are calling out to us, and we want those things, and we lust after those things, and those things can become thorns to us. Final thing I want to say about this thorny soil. This plant, as I understand it, doesn't die. The soil becomes crowded, it gets choked, but it just stays there. It becomes unfruitful. It doesn't wither up and die. Now you say, well, where are you going with that? Well, here's where I'm going with that. I think many of us today, probably most of us today, can fall into this type of soil more often than we would like to. And when we become this kind of soil, where we once were fruitful and productive, but now we have become unfruitful because we're being choked out by these concerns and distractions or pleasures of the world, here's what we become. We become pew-sitting plants. You know what I mean by that? We're plants who are just content to come on Sunday and sit in the pew, but Monday to Saturday we really don't have anything in our lives that's showing that we're a Christian. And so we come and we go through the motions and we do the things that we're supposed to do, but we don't have any other visible manifestations of passion and fervor for the Lord on Monday to Saturday. So we just become pew-sitting plants. And that's what these thorny ground hearers are. So finally, let's look at this last one. Let's talk about the good soil. And we're going to go through this one very quickly. The good soil is everything that these other soils are not. The good soil is productive. It's fruit-bearing. These are the ones who allow the seed of the gospel to sink deeply into their heart, let it germinate, sprout. They water it. They give it the sunlight that it needs. It grows. It becomes strong, and it produces fruit. And when a plant is producing fruit, then it becomes useful. I believe it was Mark chapter 11. Jesus came across a fig tree. That was a thorny ground fig tree. It had leaves, but it didn't have any fruit on it. And he cursed that fig tree. And his disciples came back the next day, and they saw that same fig tree that he had cursed. And he said, "No one will ever get fruit from you again." And that fig tree had just withered up, it shriveled up, and it died. A tree that just has leaves is of no use. A tree that only has leaves but it has no fruit is of no value. And so Jesus said, if you're not going to produce any figs, then you're of no good to anybody. And you might as well be done away with. That was a thorny ground fig tree. But Jesus says that we don't have to just be long on leaves. We can be long on leaves as well as long on fruit. We need to be growing that fruit. We need to be producing that fruit, because when we produce fruit, we're productive. What kind of fruit are we producing? Well, the fruit of the Spirit. How about that? Galatians chapter 5 talks about love, joy, peace, and long-suffering, etc. That's the fruit of the Spirit. Hebrews 12, verse 11, talks about the fruit of righteousness. So when we produce righteousness in our lives, when we go about doing good and doing right, God calls that fruit. When we do good works, Colossians 1:10 says we bear fruit in every good work that we do. So this is the kind of soil that we want to be. We don't want to be impenetrable, maybe by being ignorant, maybe by being impatient. We don't want to be shallow. We don't want to be short-term and only temporary. We need to clear out those stones, clear out those rocks so that there can be more depth of soil. We don't want to be distracted and worried and concerned about all the things that are going on in our lives. We need to get those thorns out. We need to get down on our hands and knees, and we need to start pulling weeds out of the beds so that we can become good soil. I'll close with this. Gardens don't grow themselves. By no means do I have a green thumb. I've tried to do some planting. We had a garden for a few years at our house in Alabama. And every spring we'd get excited. This is the year that we're going to turn into, garden masters. We were always wrong, but we just knew every spring this is the year. So we'd go out into the backyard and we'd bring in some good dirt, and we would clear that dirt of the rocks and the weeds, and we would get that soil ready, and we'd put conditioner on it, and it would be ready to receive the seed. I mean, this is good soil, if there ever was. And we'd dig those rows and drop those seeds in, cover, water, and sun and water and sun and water and all of that. And our garden was mediocre at best. I guess our thumb is more of a yellow than a green. But here's what I know. Had we not tilled up that soil, had we not gotten out those rocks, had we not gotten out the weeds that were already there, had we not watered those seeds after we put them in the ground, our garden would have never even been close to mediocre. There is preparatory work that has to be done when you're planting seed. We need to remember that when we are spreading the gospel to our neighbors, that there's preparatory work that has to be done if they're going to receive it and become good soil. But we need to remember it in our own lives too. Because as we think about that question, what kind of soil am I today? What kind of soil am I right now at this stage in my life? If we answer that question honestly, then we will know the kind of preparatory work that needs to be done. We will know that if we are rocky soil, it's time to be clearing some stones. We will know that if we are distracted or if we are crowded by all of these other things in the world, then it's time to be getting rid of some of those things so that we can let the seed have some space. Answer the question. What kind of soil are you right now. It may not be what you were last year. It may not be what you're going to be next year. But where are you right now? The only place that you can begin is where you are today. He who has ears to hear, let him hear, Jesus said. Fitting conclusion to the parable which is all about hearing. He who has ears, let him hear. Maybe someone here this morning who's not a Christian. We want you to become a Christian, but we don't want to see you become a Christian who gets excited for just a momentary time. We don't want you to be the rocky soil. We don't want you to fall away in just a short time. We don't want you to become the thorny soil where you become distracted. But we want you to be good soil. And we want to help you in whatever way we can. So if there's someone who needs to obey the gospel this morning, or if you need to come back to the Lord, make your life right with Him, would you please come as we stand and sing together?